Välkommen till Stolpe Stories, en podcast om litteratur och humaniora från bokförlaget Stolpe. Vår värd för programmet heter Svante Tirén.
För många kan det tyckas vara en självklarhet att den mest kompetente, det är den som ska ha jobbet. Man ska inte ärva sin position och man ska inte förfördelas bara för att man är född in i ett visst sammanhang. Men en gång i tiden var den här principen, som kallas för meritokrati, någonting ytterst revolutionärt. Under den största delen av människans historia så har vi arbetat med just ärvda positioner, ärvda privilegier. Meritokratin, alltså principen om att den som är mest kompetent ska ha jobbet och få rättigheterna, det är den som har byggt upp moderniteten. Det här ämnet har journalisten och författaren Adrian Wooldridge skrivit om. Hans bok heter Meritokratin, idén som förändrade världen. I det här avsnittet är han med och berättar mer om den här historien och varför det är ett så viktigt begrepp att reda ut. So welcome, Mr. Wooldridge.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's go into this. The term meritocracy itself is quite surprisingly modern, but the roots, of course, we find far back into history. Where do we start to look into the roots of meritocracy?
The term meritocracy was invented by a British sociologist called Michael Young in 1958. So a very, very recent term. And he coined it as a sort of as a shorthand for a society based on equality of opportunity and social mobility. But the term, the fact rather than the term, goes back a very long way. The oldest meritocracies are China. China was a society which had a huge system of examinations in order to select people for the imperial civil service very, very early on. So in the 8th century, when your and mine ancestors were running around doing strange things and being led by people called Eric Bloodaxe and other such names, China was selecting a civil service on the basis of its ability to perform in examinations in which they were tested on the Confucian classics. And this examination system lasted all the way from, let's say about the 8th century all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. It was an extraordinarily enduring system. I mean, there are breakdowns and there are certain revisions, but it's basically the same examination system all the way through. So China is the inventor of a version of meritocracy. The other inventor of a version of meritocracy in the West is Plato, who in the Republic talks about he says basically that society is divided between men of gold, men of silver, and men of bronze, or women of gold, silver, and bronze, and that you have to have a constant system of social mobility because the children of men of gold are quite often men of bronze, and the children of men of bronze are quite often men of gold. So you have to be selecting people every generation in order to create the philosopher kings who he thinks should rule society. So Plato has a vision of meritocracy. China has an actual meritocratic system which is there and rooted in the examination system. So a new word for an idea that has been around for quite a long time. But for most of history, with the exception of China, it was an unusual thing, that most of society was actually based on inheritance, who your parents were, and job opportunities were allocated primarily on the basis of patronage. Rich people gave jobs to their friends or clients. On the basis of nepotism, successful people gave jobs to their nephews or their children or their aunts, uncles, whatever, or purchase. A lot of jobs were bought and sold on the open market. The French state funded itself essentially by selling jobs. So a meritocratic state of a sort in China, a vision of meritocracy in Plato's work, but essentially the practice in the West is one of inheritance, patronage, venality, and nepotism.
Is it, in a sense, though, a bit of a universal concept in the sense that it's an idea or it's a reaction that appears in many different contexts in different parts of history, or is it more original, let's say, to, for instance, Plato and China?
I think it's unusual. I think it's unusual for three reasons. One is that it's a relatively recent practice. For most of history outside China, as I say, we've had inheritance and patronage. In most societies in the world, still, I think jobs tend to be allocated on the basis of forms of corruption or forms of nepotism or forms of connection, at least. And also, if you look into your own soul, if you look into the way you do things, you have a preference for getting opportunities for your children. We are pre-programmed as biological animals to be nepotists. That meritocracy is a way of controlling our nepotistic instincts for the good of society as a whole. So meritocracy, it might seem to people to be the natural way of organizing things. You know, what could be more sensible than to give jobs on the basis of your ability to do those jobs, on the basis of your talent, of your unique competence. But in fact, for most of human history, in most countries, we haven't had that, and that is for a very simple biological reason. We tend to favour our children. So meritocracy is something that is a rare plant, and it's also a plant which is easily killed. It needs to be nurtured.
Meritocracy is really fighting our genes, our biology
Absolutely.
In a sense.
Yeah.
The term was coined surprisingly late, considering this is an idea that's been around for a long time. And it seems also your book is the first general history of this concept. How can this be?
Amazing, really. I found it very peculiar that we have many, many histories of democracy, many histories of ideas about equality, many histories of liberalism. But I looked around and I couldn't find a single book that really looked at the history of meritocracy. There are books on civil service reforms. There are books on the history of education. There are books on the history of IQ testing. There are some books, not many, but a few on the history of the Chinese examination system. But nobody had really put all these things together and to write a history of meritocracy. Now, I've wondered to myself, why is this? Why has it never been written about in this way? And I think one reason is that we tend to take it for granted. We think that this is just a common sense way of organizing society, and we don't tend to write the history of common sense. And Hegel said, the owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. And my great fear is that the reason I came up with the idea of writing the history of meritocracy is that there are so many criticisms of meritocracy at the moment, and that perhaps we're seeing the waning of meritocracy. So we begin to see that it's a historically unique and important thing because it's being subjected to attacks.
So is it really an example of an idea that seems so evident, so obvious that nobody touches upon it?
That's right. That's right. I think that's the case. As I say, people have written about bits of it, but never as a sort of comprehensive history. And I couldn't believe this. You know, as a writer, it's a wonderful thing to discover that something, you know, hasn't been written about, which is an important subject.
So how did you go about them? Because it's a very tangled history, isn't it, that touches upon so many different things.
Yes.
How did you create your research around this?
As a young man, I wrote a DPhil thesis, a PhD thesis on the history of IQ testing. So I had a body of knowledge about IQ testing. Then I just read around that. Then I looked more and more about the history of examinations. Then I began to look at the history of China, and I began to look at the history of the Jewish diaspora and the role of ideas of talent and ability in that community. But serendipity more than anything else. Just looking around and reading around. And then, you know, there are lots and lots of different paths one goes down to. If you look at the history of corporations, which I'm interested in again, you see one notion or one avenue in which meritocracy has risen. But then I had to start looking at medieval history, church history of the Middle Ages, and again, of course, looking at Plato and the role of Plato's ideas in filtering down through the ages. But I found that some of the best and most interesting sort of quasi-histories that I found were written, let's say, in the 19th century by the people who were creating meritocracy in the first place. The advocates of open competition, the advocates of examinations would try and justify their claims on the basis of historical examples. So I found a lot of the modern history is remarkably weak on this subject. For example, there's a wonderful series called the Oxford History of Britain. So I looked at the volume about the mid-19th century in Britain, because I wanted to find out about the idea of turning the civil service to examinations and open competition rather than purchasing jobs and giving jobs on the basis of connections. So there was a report which revised the way the civil service was organised by Northcote and Trevelyan that says open competition is the way forward. And I discovered it isn't mentioned in this 800-page history. So it's remarkable how little attention was paid. And as you say, because people just took it for granted. Common sense is something that we don't tend to write about.
The History of Common Sense. I wonder if that exists.
A wonderful book. I'm sure it would be a wonderful book. You can write it.
Someone have to do it. Was meritocracy called something else or referred to as something other than that before, historically?
What my book is essentially, I say it's a history of meritocracy. It's also a history of ideas about merit. What is merit? And before Michael Young comes up with the term meritocracy, people tend to talk about virtues and talents and open competition. So there's never a reference to meritocracy. There's sometimes reference to merit, but not that often. Mostly they're talking about virtues, talents, and character. They tend to talk about character quite a lot. So it's because it doesn't have a single word, it's quite hard to find its roots. And then if you look at the founding fathers of the United States, for example, they're very, very keen on the idea of an aristocracy of, not quite an aristocracy of talents, an aristocracy of virtues. They talk about a natural aristocracy as opposed to a tinsel aristocracy. The tinsel aristocracy is the landed elite, which inherits its position because you're born the son of a land or the daughter of a landowner. So they say that's a tinsel, that's an artificial aristocracy. The real aristocracy is the aristocracy of talent, people who are virtuous, talented, intelligent. And so they're not using the phrase meritocracy, they're using the phrase aristocracy of talent. Again, in France, the similar sort of use of language.
Now, before we go into modern times, we have to mention also the Jewish example, which is very interesting.
Yes. When Plato talks about his meritocracy, by which he means the rule of philosopher kings, he's talking about an imaginary world. But basically it's an imaginary city-state. It's a place in his imagination. When China is talking about the rule of the Confucian elite, it's talking about China. It's talking about this huge sort of imperial country, this vast country. But what you have is a third notion of meritocracy, and that's the Jewish notion of meritocracy. And it's the idea that we should owe reverence to a scholarly, priestly elite. And what happens is that divorces the idea of merit from the idea of ruling particular places, because it's a diaspora. These are people who don't have a homeland, who are scattered right across the world, but nevertheless put an enormous emphasis on the importance of scholarly attainment, the importance of cognitive ability, because they are people who are defined by their relationship with a body of texts, and who, because they're not allowed to own land and not allowed to, naturally, to work in the church, they tend to do trading jobs, business jobs, which involve a lot of cognitive skills. And so they create a sort of global network, but also a global idea of academic excellence, cognitive ability. So Plato is about a place, albeit imaginary. China is about a place, but the Jewish idea of merit is about a portable set of skills which unites a scattered people.
Mm. And if we say then that meritocracy created modernity, could you give a few examples of how?
Well, I talked about the first meritocracy, which is China, but that's a very static world. All the way from 800 to the beginning of the 20th century, that is a world in which your membership of the elite is determined by your ability to interpret and play around with texts, a set of Confucian texts. And what you're doing, if you can pass these examinations and become part of the Confucian elite, is you're essentially reinforcing the power of the hereditary ruler, who is the emperor. So as a meritocrat, as a Confucian scholar, you're still the servant of an essentially static society. What happens in the late 18th and early 19th century is that meritocracy becomes an instrument of social mobility. And what you have is the idea not that you should have a few people who are chosen to serve a traditional ruling class, but the whole of society should be reordered on the basis of talent. And everybody should not start from the same place, but should basically start from a position of presumed equality and should get ahead on the basis of their talents. So you have these three revolutions. You have the French Revolution, get rid of the aristocrats and the king, and create a society of a career open to talents. You have the American Revolution, get rid of the tinsel aristocracy, replace it by a natural aristocracy. And you have the British Revolution, which is much slower, but basically says that jobs in the administration, jobs in the civil service, and jobs in academia should be given on the basis of your performance in examinations. And that says not just that we're in the business of hauling up a few people from the bottom to serve us, but we're also in the business essentially of creating a society organized on the basis of talent.
But it's a messy history, this one, isn't it?
Totally.
Because a lot of these revolutions, the French, for instance, I mean, they had meritocratic ambitions, but it certainly didn't end up that way.
Yes, absolutely. It's a messy revolution, and it goes backwards quite quickly. So the French Revolution, Napoleon is the great advocate of the careers open to talent and everybody getting ahead on the basis of their individual abilities. And he comes not from nothing, but from a very obscure background and becomes the emperor of the world. But he does become an emperor, and he gets into the business of marrying off his children to the aristocracy, to kings and the rest of it, and bringing back the old French aristocracy. So he creates a marriage between the new regime, which he's created, and the old regime. And towards the end of his life, he becomes very sentimental about the aristocracy and says they're much better people and they're marvellous people. So meritocracy goes backwards quite often. And the other thing that happens is meritocracy disguises itself. So in Britain, you have a system whereby the Queen remains in charge of the country and the aristocracy continues to have a lot of power. But behind the scenes, you have these meritocrats ruling in disguise. So one of the great writers about Britain is a man called Walter Bagehot, who says basically that Britain is a republic disguised as a monarchy. And it's also to some extent a meritocracy disguised as an aristocracy. So the real power is in the hands of quite wily, intelligent people who rule behind the scenes. And you have a lot of sort of aristocrats in what Bagehot says, they're in the gilded carriages at the front of the queue. Everybody in the public is looking at them, but they're not doing they're not having the real power. So there's a lot of byways of, hidden byways of meritocracy.
It's not a smooth path at all.
Not a smooth path. It's the very opposite of a smooth path.
When in history could we say that meritocracy has more or less taken over?
Well, I think what happened after the Second World War was a golden era of meritocracy, partly because the idea of equality of opportunity, by which they meant not the opportunity for everybody to be equal, but the opportunity for everybody to get ahead regardless of their background, is the dominant idea. You have a massive expansion of educational opportunity and an expansion of secondary education followed by an expansion of university education, not to make everybody the same, but to allow upward mobility. And that's true in the United States. It's very true in Britain. I think it's true in Sweden as well. And then what you get is the ossification of the meritocracy, or a marriage between money and merit. You have people who are rich decide to become meritocrats, and people who meritocrats naturally become rich. They have opportunities, and once they become rich, they entrench themselves by trying to pass their privileges onto their children. At the same time, you get a sort of egalitarian current in schooling, which says that let's get rid of the avenues of upward mobility. Let's get rid of this ladder of opportunity, because what we really need to do is to create a society in which everybody's equal. You have this shift to the left on the part of... So meritocracy is an idea which is essentially created by the left. It's created by the Labour Party in Britain. It's all about creating more and more opportunities for people who haven't had opportunities, for women, for ethnic minorities, and particularly for working class people. And then it becomes, the left suddenly embraces not equality of opportunity, but equality of results. And that means that the left begins to dismantle these avenues of upward mobility and create comprehensive schools, mixed ability schools, and the rest of it. At the same time as that's happening, the middle classes, and particularly the old elites, discover the virtues of meritocracy. They discover the importance of making sure that their own children are educationally successful. And the result of this combination of the dismantling of avenues of upward mobility with the old elites becoming more au fait with the importance of education is that levels levels of social mobility begin to go down. You have a marriage between meritocracy and plutocracy, and this is particularly true in the Anglo-Saxon world, that there's much lower social mobility than there ever was. So a golden age of meritocracy and upward mobility, equality of opportunity from 1945 through to the middle of the 60s. Then a degeneration or a decadence of the meritocratic ideal.
And perhaps this is also both the fascinating and complicated aspect here to capture the history. It shifts right and left and upwards and downwards. It's very, very shifting in who proclaims it and why.
So meritocracy is invented by the left, the liberal left, taken up by the Labour Party and by the socialist left, and then there's a sort of swapping. The right, that the left abandons meritocracy in the name of equality of outcome, and the right begins to pick up on the idea of meritocracy. But the right sees meritocracy through the prism of markets. It says, let's create entrepreneurship, let's let people rise to their natural level in society, and let's, anybody who can send their children to private schools, that's wonderful. Let's increase the number of people who can go to private schools, and let's do that. But what the right never does is to see the importance of public education as a vehicle of upward mobility for the working classes.
I asked around a few friends of mine before this interview, do you know what is meritocracy and so on? It seems to me a lot of people know the basic concept quite well, the fact that it should be based on talent and so on. But once you go beyond those basic principles, it gets very muddy and people have very strong opinions about what it means and how it's implicated. But if we start with you, what according to you are the big misunderstandings about meritocracy today?
I think the biggest misunderstanding of meritocracy is the idea that meritocracy is an idea created by the ruling class in order to perpetuate its rule, that it's essentially a conservative idea which is all about justifying inequality. And that's very much the orthodoxy on the left, the Marxist left, the Black Lives Matter left and the rest of it. And I think if you look at the history of meritocracy, it's been a radical idea proposed mostly by the left in order to increase opportunities, and something that has been taken up by women, ethnic minorities, working class people in order to increase their opportunities. So I think a radical idea that's misinterpreted as a conservative idea. Now, there are all sorts of very difficult ideas. We ask the question, what is talent? And what do you mean by talent? And then we say, well, what determines talent? Is it nature or nurture? Is it genetics or is it your opportunities and your environment? And if it's determined by genetics, what right do we have to ownership of talent, or to say that we deserve opportunities just because we happen to be lucky enough to be born clever? All of those questions are extremely intricate and difficult.
Because it's the same with the current criticism, isn't it? It comes from very different directions.
Absolutely.
You have from the left, you also have, I know you mentioned the Trumpists also having a problem with meritocracy.
Well, we have this extraordinary position at the moment whereby this revolutionary idea that has completely transformed the world is loathed by very different groups of people. So you have a criticism of meritocracy from the Trumpists, from the right, who say that meritocracy is all about preening self-satisfied experts who consider themselves to be better than ordinary people and who have made a mess of running the world. So if you think of who created the global financial crisis in 2008, it was, the technocratic banking elites, all these clever people. So the Trumpists hate the meritocrats. The left, particularly the Black Lives Matter left, hate meritocracy because they think it's all about justifying the privileges of a white middle-class elite. Also, you have some very interesting and powerful criticisms of meritocracy being made from the centre by academics who themselves work at the heart of the meritocratic system. So you have a person called Daniel Markovits, who teaches at Yale Law School, who says that meritocracy is a sort of trap. It's a sort of tyranny which makes us work hard for ever-diminishing returns. We have to spend 60 hours a week working and we don't get to enjoy life. Or you have somebody called Michael Sandel at Harvard, political scientist or political philosopher, I should say, at Harvard, who says that meritocracy is a tyranny and that it's based on a false notion, the notion of desert. It's based on the notion that you deserve your your privileges if you happen to work hard and to be educationally successful. So this incredible period of criticism from every direction. As I say, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk.
So it's criticized from left, right, center, and everywhere. But where are, outspoken or not, the great supporters of meritocracy today?
Well, I think that you have a peculiar situation here, because a lot of people, like your friends, will say, of course I believe in meritocracy. I believe that people who work hard and who are talented should be given more rewards, and I don't like nepotism, I don't like corruption, I don't like patronage and all of that. But if you press them more, it turns out that they're not quite as enthusiastic about meritocracy as they think they are. So I would say that there's a lot of soft support of meritocracy, which is easy to push aside, and not that many people who are outspoken exponents of meritocracy. And I would say that I'm one of those people, and I've been going around doing that. But I tend to find that there are more critics than there are supporters.
At least that you can hear, let's say.
That I can hear, yeah.
I know your answer to most of those debates is that the big problem isn't meritocracy itself, it's that we have too little of it.
Yeah.
And you're also pointing out that it's a very vulnerable idea.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I think meritocracy is something, as I say, that we quite often take for granted, and that we quite often think is just common sense. And once you think something is common sense, you tend not to be very articulate or very forceful in defending it. As I say, it's in fact, a very delicate plant. Through most of history, we haven't had it. In most societies, we haven't had it. And it's pushing against our natural nepotistic instincts. So it's something that needs to be watered. It's a plant that needs to be watered and nurtured, and certainly not a plant that we should be dousing in poison, as we've tended to do recently. So a delicate thing, something that needs nurturing. But also one of the biggest dangers of meritocracy, as I say, is not from the left, not from the right, not from the centre, but it's from the decadence of meritocracy itself. It's from the fact that the cognitive elites, that successful people are very good at securing opportunities for their children, which they do naturally, and very good at disguising privilege in the terms of education. You say, my child has done very well at school and has got into the best universities, not because I've given it advantages, but because it happens to be very clever. So I think that may be the case, but it's quite often not the case. You get lots of marginal people doing very well. And what we need to do in order to perpetuate meritocracy is to make sure that there's more opportunities for poorer people to get really rigorous and academic educations and to become challengers too. So as Plato said, you always need to be infusing, reinforcing the system by opportunities for outsiders to become as successful as insiders are. So it's this decadence, this degeneration, this refusal to, this hoarding of opportunities, which is my biggest worry about meritocracy at the moment. So let's look at Harvard University, for example. There are more people at Harvard University from the top 2% of the population in terms of wealth than there are from the bottom 50% of the population in terms of wealth. That's not an accurate reflection of the distribution of natural talent within the population. And you can do all that you want in terms of having a bit of affirmative action, or you can do all that you want in saying that meritocracy is a tyranny or a trap or whatever else it is. But it's clearly the case that we're ignoring a huge amount of talent, and we're doing that because we're not looking for talent. We're not searching for talent. We're not looking for all these hidden Einsteins in the population. And I think that's unjust. It's an injustice in itself, and that's bad. But it's also even more worrying because there is a country out there called China. As I said, China invented this concept of meritocracy. It became degenerate in China because they just tested all these Confucian texts. But now they're going back to their roots. They've got very rigorous examinations. They've got a very expansive schooling and university system. But this time, they're not looking for your ability to interpret Confucius. They're looking for your ability to do chemistry and physics and engineering and mathematics and all of these subjects. They're searching their populations for talented people, and they may well pull ahead of the West. I mean, in certain areas, artificial intelligence being one of them, they have more first-rate scientists in artificial intelligence now than the United States does. And so meritocracy, which used to be reinforcing essentially the West and reinforcing fundamentally liberal societies, the liberal societies are beginning to abandon it as an ideal and as an aim and as a practice at the time when the Chinese are doing more to embrace it. So meritocracy might go from being a tool of liberalism to being a tool of Chinese authoritarianism. And that's not something we want to see, I think, because that means that economic dynamism will increasingly shift to the east and away from the west.
So basically, I mean, it takes ages to build up meritocratic systems and so on. They go not on a smooth path, but in fact quite messy ones. But it's very quickly dissolved.
As I say, for these reasons, one, that we regard it as common sense, the natural order of things, and the other is that we have this gaming of the system by privileged people to make sure that their children have all the opportunities available. Meritocracy is something which has to be constantly fought for and constantly reinforced by an active role for the state, for the government, the public sector, in saying we're going to look for talent throughout the population and we're going to give it the opportunities that it needs and deserves. And unfortunately, we have a public sector which is instinctively egalitarian rather than preoccupied by talent. We have a cognitive elite which surreptitiously wants not too much competition for its own children and wants to hoard opportunities for itself. And we don't have a sense of the economic importance of talent. So we have a danger of sinking gently into decadence. And I tell the story at the end of my book of what happened in Venice. Venice in the early Middle Ages was an relatively open society, a society which is extraordinarily dynamic, becomes one of the great sea trading empires in the world. It doesn't have a king, it has a doge. It doesn't have a hereditary landed aristocracy. It has a sort of oligarchy based on talent, on your ability to do things. And it has high levels of social mobility. And then what happens in the late Middle Ages is that the oligarchy decides that it's sick of social mobility. Social mobility is tiring. It's difficult. So they create a list of great families who are then allowed to monopolize all the top positions. And basically they then circulate all these top positions among themselves. So they freeze society, freeze social mobility. And what happens as a result of that? Venice goes into long-term decline. It becomes a decadent city. It's an incredibly beautiful place, but it's not renewing itself with new talents. It's not the seaborne empire that it used to be. It becomes, a backwater, essentially, a beautiful backwater, but nevertheless a backwater. And I'm worried that that is the future of the West, that the West, unless it's willing to take talent seriously and invest seriously in the pursuit, the recruitment, the cultivation of talent, will become a sort of backwater while China roars ahead and uses the meritocratic ideal to reinforce its system of authoritarian party rule.
So if you want a premonition, look at Venice, simply.
Absolutely, but the trouble is not everywhere is as beautiful as Venice. At least Venice could rely on its beauty. You know, if Silicon Valley becomes a decadent place, it doesn't even have, the beauty. It just has,
It lacks a little bit of romantic palaces.
It doesn't have romantic things. It has a few, car washes and used car places. Not much more than that.
Now, there are two main areas of debate around this. One is, of course, regarding the ethics of testing, and the other is what other values and principles do you combine with the idea of meritocracy. If we start by testing, I mean, of course, testing is ethically very challenging. Where do we start pointing out some of the basic ideas here on meritocracy and what it needs in terms of fair testing, objective testing, and so forth?
I think the important thing about testing is it's not the be-all and end-all. And if somebody fails the test, that's the end of their life. It's one way amongst other ways of looking for talent. So I think we must be very active in our search for talent, but we must also be aware that certain ways of finding talent, such as holistic assessment, such as scholastic examinations, such as teachers' assessments, they have their own failings. And it's quite often a good way to supplement them with quantitative tests, IQ tests or SATs or other forms of tests, because they can give us some information about people who might not be good at writing essays because they haven't got parents who teach them how to write essays, or might not be assessed as being very bright by teachers because teachers are notoriously class biased in the way that they look for talent. So I'm not saying testing is the only way, but it should be one of a battery of ways. So we should always be looking for talent, not in order to eliminate people, but to include people in the world of opportunity. And I think one of the things about IQ tests and SAT tests is they quite frequently reveal talent where you hadn't expected it to be. And again, it's the hidden Einsteins of the problem. We know that middle-class people will have their talents recognized. What we also find is that certain groups of people are ignored, passed over. And one of the reasons they're passed over is that we're not doing enough to shine a torch, to look for them actively. And I think tests should be one way in which we're trying to recruit people for opportunity.
But is this one of the misunderstandings today, the fact that some people perhaps connect meritocracy to only this sort of rigid testing thing? Or like,
yes.
Yeah.
It used to be the case. I mean, I went through this system in Britain that we had something called the 11 plus. At the age of 11, we were tested by what were basically IQ tests. And if you failed those tests, you went to the secondary modern, and that you were sort of eliminated from the system. That was a very cruel and unjust system. So we shouldn't just be in the business of eliminating people. We should be in the business of using these tests as one way of finding people. It's a positive process of finding talent. And I think, one thing I would do is significantly expand the number of gifted school programs and use, amongst a mix of other things, IQ tests to look for gifted, talented people. Now, one example I use about this is there's an Israeli military division called 8200, which is essentially an intelligence division of the army and is trying to find very bright people who can work at a high level with computers and various other sort of techniques. And they've been very concerned to diversify the sort of people they have. So they thought that they hadn't done enough for less educationally privileged people. So they decided to go around looking at people's scores in video arcades and see how well people did in video arcades. And they discovered that there are all these people who are doing incredibly well in video arcades who weren't doing well in maths at school because they weren't interested in maths at school, but they clearly had extraordinary visuospatial skills that meant that they were champions, and they found that the same people were champions. So they recruited some of these people. They also went and looked at the Hasidic female population and started giving these Hasidic women who were basically brought up to be baby machines and brought up to do very unskilled jobs. And they discovered a huge number of them could actually do really well on these IQ tests. So they started recruiting them as well. So they were actively going out and using a battery of tests to find talent where it hadn't been recognized before. And lo and behold, they found it. In Britain, during the Second World War, we had Bletchley Park, where we needed to recruit extremely bright people to try and break the German codes. And we ran out of very bright people. So we thought, who haven't we got here? So we discovered that we didn't have very many women, and we discovered that we didn't have many people who hadn't been to posh universities. So they started putting crossword puzzles in newspapers and said, if you can complete this crossword, we'd like to interview you. So they found that lots of people who were basically housewives, who were women who weren't very well educated, could do these crosswords because they were extremely bright, but their talents hadn't been recognized. So they did these crosswords, and then they recruited them to become code breakers in Bletchley Park. So there are lots of ways in which you can use these tests of raw academic ability to discover talent where it's not existed. And what we're seeing at the moment is too many people who have high levels of cognitive ability being ignored. And that's not good for society. It's not good for the individuals who, don't have their talents fully developed.
There are untapped resources of talent everywhere, but there have to be a very dynamic process in how you discover them and what measurements you use.
So I'm saying use these tests as part of a proactive thing, not to eliminate people, but to find people who might otherwise be overlooked, the hidden Einsteins.
finally, we are reaching, as far as we know, the age of so-called artificial intelligence, which puts this to the test yet again. Yeah. What is your hopes and worries for the future if we look at how we define meritocracy and how we discover it?
Let me make 2 points about that. One is that artificial intelligence is extremely good at recognizing patterns. So there'll be lots of people who have got jobs on the basis of their ability to recognize patterns, regularities in numbers and things like that, who will be outcompeted by machines, because machines can simply do this automatically. And so you'll find lots of people who are part of the cognitive elite, who are lawyers or accountants or radiologists, who'll suddenly find that their jobs are taken away by clever machines, because the clever machines are just doing this. It's routine, basically. It doesn't involve a high degree of innovation or creativity. It requires a high degree of intelligence, but it's an intelligence, sort of intelligence that machines can do. So I think we will see a number of people who've been part of the cognitive elite losing their jobs or being displaced by machines, and they will have to move into areas that machines can't do. So that will create a lot of social disruption, I think, because a lot of people who've been used to having high-status jobs may find themselves losing those jobs. Secondly, I think that we have a world in which the meritocracy is dominated by a certain sort of intelligence. It's dominated by mathematical ability, by scientific ability, by engineering ability. And the sort of people who rise to power are the people like the Zuckerbergs of this world who have that kind of intelligence. And we shouldn't ignore the fact that there are other sorts of intelligence. Let's say your ability to read poetry and understand poetry, or read history or understand history, the sort of humanistic intelligence as well. So in the world of machines, of clever machines, we need to make sure that human beings concentrate on the sort of things that only human beings can do. And that is much more about creativity, about humanity, about the humane learning. And we have to make sure that we don't try and create just a purely technocratic elite, but we also have a sort of humanistic elite that understands what it is to be human. So, more reading of Plato, I think, and more training in the whole old humanistic subjects, because we need to understand better what it is that makes us human, but also need to understand better what it is that makes human beings bad, destructive.
And now we finally have, at last, a comprehensive history, thanks to you.
That's very kind of you to say.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you indeed.
Tack för att du har lyssnat på Stolpe Stories. Missa inte att du som lyssnar har 20% rabatt på bokförlaget Stolpes titlar hos Bokus.com. Aktivera rabatten genom att ange koden Stolpe20. Och för att lyssna på fler avsnitt, följ oss där poddar finns och på sociala medier.